Is the U.S. economy due for a recession? That's what I'm thinking. You know, it's very popular to predict recessions. You know, a couple of years ago, something like 98% of all prognosticators predicted a downturn in the economy. Of course, that never came to be. At some point, we're due for it, right? And as longtime viewers of this show know, I tend to be pretty optimistic about life in general, and specifically about our economy, investments, and the long-term view of our financial futures. But there's a couple things that have me thinking that maybe there's some clouds on the horizon, and I wanted to share those things with you. The first one here, we'll pull it up on the screen. LEI is some of the leading economic indicators, and you can see on the screen here sort of the significance of this chart is that blue line. The economic indicators seem to, have at least in the last couple of decades, they turn over pretty substantially in advance of economic recessions, right? So we can go back and take a look, down in 2003, 4, 5, I guess 6 into 7, right? And before the credit crisis, a couple of years ago before COVID, 5 years already, right? But things were starting to turn over a little bit, and then we had COVID, and then, all of the stimulus packages that went with that. But now we're seeing those leading economic indicators turn down again. So I'm not predicting, hey, we're going to have a recession, but there's some evidence that it might be the case, right? And we'll talk in a minute about what we do about that. But let's flip over to this next slide here and talk about what happens when we have a recession. People are fearful. You hear, oh, recession, it sounds scary. But really what happens, take a look at this chart. Red bar, or red line, I should say, is the S&P 500, and those gray bars are recessionary periods, and this goes back all the way to the 1950s. And check out, where those gray bars are, and the red, the S&P tends to turn over. We have a downturn before the recession, right? We tend to think of those things interchangeably. Oh, we're in recession, markets are down. Markets go down before that, right? Not during that. And markets turn around. If you look at the other side, they go up before the recession's over, right? And so the leading economic indicators in the stock market can be a predictor of those things, not a reactor to that, right? It's sort of the opposite of what we think about things. And so as you take a look at this chart on the very long term, we're not seeing the market turn over just yet here on things. But again, it wouldn't be surprising if we do see that, right? That's sort of the takeaway on that. And then if we take a look, I got a couple of other charts I wanted to show just talking about that S&P 500. So this is our traditional chart as far as taking a look at the growth in the S&P 500 over, again, going back over a fairly long term. It gets skewed as we go up the slideshow here, but if we take it on a logarithmic scale rather than an arithmetic, this kind of evens things out. Now we can see on the red chart there, that's the S&P including dividends, right? And we can see, going back into the 90s, things very overvalued. If you take a look at that long-term 10.5% return, the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, even with high prices, not so much. But now we're seeing that, the last 3 or 4 years in here, 5 years, that we have been quite a bit above that long-term trend line. So we've got leading economic indicators seeming to, to predict, hey, we're up for a downturn in the economy, which might mean a downturn in the stock market before then. Stocks are pretty richly priced, it looks like, based on history. So that shows that, I wouldn't be surprised here at some point in the near future we see that recession. What does it mean from an investment standpoint? We've been over this many times before. Build your portfolio so that when we have a downturn in the economy, when we have a downturn in the stock market, when we get to recessions, it's ready for that, not taking action in advance of that. I just thought these charts were interesting. Again, typically I tend to be pretty much on the optimistic side, look for the good because bad sells. I think we might have some things that predict that. We'll see what happens with it, but I wanted you to be aware of it. Interested, as always, in knowing what you're thinking. What do you see in these charts? What do you think might happen going forward? Jot a comment in the comment box. Let's have a conversation. And as always, thanks for watching.